That's why transparency is good, because people are skeptical and you need to tell them the truth.
Welcome to the Swisspreneur Show, a podcast about startup stories and learnings from experienced entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Sylvan.
Oliver, a very warm welcome to the Swisspreneur Show. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thanks for having me. Super happy.
You're the co-founder and former CEO at Carbon Delta, a leading environmental fintech and data analytics firm specializing in climate change scenario analysis. And before we dive into your startup and what you exactly do or did before you sold the company, we want to start with your personal background. You are an ETH alumni, and your educational background is in computer science, but also in meteorology. Why combine the two? What did that bring of value to you to have a combination of both of them?
Well, when I studied computer science in Germany, there was an educational system where you had to have what was called a minor subject. So I was studying computer science, and after 2 years, they asked me to sign up for a second thing. And so I was actually, the University of Bonn had a meteorology program. And so I was riding my bike past this building that had all these, the measurement devices that were measuring all sorts of, weather phenomena on it. And I thought it was really interesting, super interesting. I was more interested in the technology and the building than, in the weather per se. Like, some people that do paragliding or something like that, they're like really interested in the weather. And then to my big surprise, I was at that university, and it's a big university, actually the first student to have that combination. And I then met a second student, and we actually ended up working together, and she had meteorology as a major and computer science as a minor. And we had a really great time because we felt like we were, sort of this little team. And the most surprising thing about this is that, when you look back into the history of computer science, then, you come across this German scientist, Neumann, and he actually, the reason for building computers was to assess whether it would be possible to pre-compute the weather. So it's one of the first applications for computers. Now, the other funny thing is that weather forecasting programs, they're very complex programs. And I think everybody can imagine that because you're solving very complicated mathematical equations. You have a lot of physical processes that you need to model. There's a lot of input-output, operation going on. And mostly they're running on parallel computers, and they're complicated computers. So, but most weather forecasting programs are very old, and they're written in Fortran, a programming language that nobody today normally learns or knows. It was invented when I was born in the 70s. So that was, and leading to Carbon Delta, that was part of the reason I ended up going away from meteorology, because as a computer scientist, to be quite honest, one of the biggest drivers from moving away from, working for weather services was that I just couldn't deal with programming in Fortran anymore. I had learned Python, and at the time it was new. I, like many others, felt like this was the actual future of programming. And so, when I got the opportunity, I switched from weather forecasting into the financial industry. And that was actually the actual interesting combination, knowing a little bit about atmospheric science and then the financial industry.
And that's exactly what you did. You became the IT head at Fish Asset Management. And there you actually stayed for 10 years in total. So that's quite a long time. So what was so appealing to really stay there, and what did you actually do at Fish Asset Management?
We were a team of about 10, 15 programmers and system engineers, and we built the internal portfolio management system for fish asset management. And that was super satisfying because it was like more of a build a job than a buy and run job. And that was extremely appealing because I guess in most large financial institutions, you don't get to write the actual portfolio management system. You get to install and run the system. Second of all, I mean, I was a really big fan of fish asset management. And I would say that I've, taken a number of business practices from that firm over to Carbon Delta. And it was a very interesting journey. Essentially, fish asset management was at the end of its startup life. I was number 17 at fish asset management. So we were quite small. When I left, we were like 85. So I was able to see a company grow from, sort of a family to more of a department, separated, more centrally run firm.
Right. You mentioned the practices that you learned there. Do you have anything to share there? What really stuck with you that helped you also along the way as an entrepreneur afterwards?
Well, there's a fairly large number of things. Let me mention a few. One is transparency. Mm-hmm. Transparency was, and I think still is, really big at fish asset management. And I think it's a business practice that is becoming more and more important. I guess most people know the story of Buffer, for example, in the US, where, they're like super transparent. You could see, almost live the salary of everybody. And there were a number of business practices I learned from my boss at the time. May it be techniques like the Harvard technique for negotiation. May it be some of the practices I learned from my IT partner at the firm regarding IT security and running meetings. It's really a vast set, and I would say that overall I would have liked to go into the entrepreneurial space much earlier. I was 40, and I had decided I wanted to do it now because I felt like if I hadn't done it at that point in life, I would never do it. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I think my experience in business did help to run Carbon Delta. I would have run it very differently without that experience.
I can fully imagine. We talk about that in a second, but before we do so, I would like to bring back the transparency that you just mentioned. There are also well-known people like Ray Dalio, for example, from Bridgewater Associates, who also even wrote a book about the principles. And there he also preaches radical transparency within his firm. So I just wonder, why is transparency so important to build a firm, and what did it actually bring you? Or also ask differently, what does transparency actually mean to you in a business context?
Well, one thing I understood when I was taking this class on Harvard negotiation that I talked about earlier, in the very beginning, they played a little game, and the game was a prisoner's dilemma kind of game. And I'll tell you the story. I was thinking it all comes back to, doing the smartest thing. So we were playing this game, and I was thinking, how can I influence the game in the best possible way? So I thought I have to do something extraordinary. So what I did was I stood up and I said, look, guys, this is a prisoner's dilemma type game. We're all best if we cooperate. So the first thing I'm going to tell you is I will always cooperate. I'm giving you my word for it. Until the end of the game, 12 rounds, I'm going to cooperate. And I would like all of you to do the same thing. And after 3 or 4 rounds of cooperation, we will all know that we're all cooperating and will be really, really extraordinary. And it worked well for 3 rounds. And on the 4th round, somebody started not cooperating. And it just killed me. I was like thinking, how's this possible? And I thought about this for a long time. And I came to the conclusion, it's natural for people to be skeptical. And there's nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing. And that goes back to the transparency. If you're not transparent, people are naturally going to be skeptical. And the fantasy that they have is much worse than the reality. So let's, put it back to, let's say salaries. Maybe somebody sees I'm earning less than someone else and I think I should earn more. That's probably a hurtful feeling. But the feeling, I don't know what somebody else is making, and that person might make a lot more than I'm doing, that's even worse. So that's why transparency is good, because people are skeptical and you need to tell them the truth.
So in that regard, would you say no matter what company you will be involved in, transparency would always be one of the core values in that regard?
Absolutely. There's no other way to do business. Absolutely.
I really like that. And I think that's an important discussion that many startups also here in Switzerland probably just take up way too late down the road. So they don't really define or talk about the core values early on and just miss it. And then you do have a certain culture, but it's not really formulated or well defined. And then later down the road, you start talking about it. And then you just realize, oh, that's probably how our values look like.
Well, to be honest, I think maybe building on what you said, I think what actually we should have is more of a standard set of values that are, best practices that, lead to good business outcomes. I don't think transparency needs to be discussed, in my view. Okay. I think it should be assumed. Maybe it should just be, agreed upon in the very beginning.
Got it. Are there any other core values that come to mind that are important to you?
I mean, I'm in the business of sustainability. And in my view, I'm not going to do any other business than business that leads to sustainability. And I see sustainability as a new element in the having fun, risk and return, those maybe very high-level objectives, because I think there are some planetary boundaries that, we're embarking on that we cannot ignore. And the earlier we realize that, the better. And I always say climate change is a great example because our analysis shows that around 50% of the economy needs to decarbonize. That is maybe the biggest societal transformation we've ever gone through. But at the same time, it's the biggest business opportunity. So I like that convergence of that you need to do something, but it's a great business opportunity at the same time.
Sounds like a great combination to tackle, basically. And that's exactly what he did after staying 10 years at Fish Asset Management. In 2015, you decided to leave. Was it the idea of Carbon Delta that led you to leave the good company that you worked for?
Yes, definitely.
And how did that happen? How did you come up with the idea and then decided, okay, now it's time to actually start my own company and jump ship?
So a friend of mine called me and told me, Oliver, I'm really excited. I created a Wikipedia page for the carbon bubble. And, I was very hesitant to even consider looking at that because there are, so many crazy ideas in the climate space. And I didn't know at the time how difficult it is to create a Wikipedia page because most pages get deleted immediately, right? Because they're not deemed relevant. which I think is a great quality filter. But I looked at the page anyhow, and the carbon bubble is an economic theory that says the following. A bubble is a financial markets effect where a part of the market, for example, all .com companies or mortgage loans or something, are overvalued because everybody's missing a certain piece of information. And the carbon bubble theory says that all oil, coal, and gas companies are totally overvalued because they'll never be able to sell all that oil and coal and gas because of limits of global warming. So now we have a remaining budget of around 500 gigatons of CO2. Then we're hitting the 2-degree limit. But if you look at the reserves that oil, coal, and gas companies today have and convert that into CO2 equivalent, it's around 2,500 gigatons. So it's a factor of 5. And that's why, some economists are saying they're never going to be able to sell that. So, share prices, for example, are just basically imagining future profits. If those future profits are only 1/5 of what people are analyzing, then they're overvalued. And I went to Fish Asset Management and asked some very conservative people, what do you think about that theory? And they said, that's interesting. And that was the second I decided somebody has to create a company that calculates this on a company level, on an issuer or security level, because that macro theory is of no use for a portfolio manager. The macro theory doesn't tell you, should I buy or sell this oil company?
Got it. And then how do you actually take this idea and actually build a company then? What were the next steps that you tackled with your friend?
Well, I think that might have been, that was one of the mistakes I did at Carbon Delta. I asked a friend of mine who was a programmer, if I leave Fish, would you join me? And the guy said yes. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to bootstrap the company by myself with this programming pal. And that was a huge illusion. I realized after a few months when I was, starting to be very, very tired and worn out, that 2 people is just not enough to start a company. And so the problem at the time was that I had already, set up the name. I was in the Climate Kick funding program. I had built a website. I had started programming the first versions of our computational system. So, there was a lot of bootstrapping going on already. I was thinking, I now need co-founders that, I get along with, that are looking for a job now, that are ready to work for very little money, and they would have to now like my product and business idea. And I was taking it very technically, and I was sort of multiplying those probabilities. I was thinking it's practically impossible. I was really thinking, after one person left me that I had started collaborating with, I was really thinking this idea is dead.
Wow.
And I don't know. It's just, I kept on, looking for people, and I ended up, getting to know David and Elke, and it was just a total dream team. It was really a fantastic team. It just worked like a charm, and I don't know how that happened, but I think when you start a company, I think you need to know 2 things. First of all, everything's going to be very different to what you plan. And, it's like a total roller coaster ride. One day somebody leaves you, the next day a new client comes around the corner. So I think people should expect that a lot of doors will be, shut and open at the same time. So, you just have to be mentally ready for that. I think that's all.
Is there anything that can prepare you to become mentally ready for that roller coaster ride? Or is it just you have to experience it and get better the more often you basically expose yourself to that situation?
Well, I don't know. Preparation. I think I like the way our society sort of moves in Europe towards entrepreneurship. I think it's valued more and more, when you risk and try something. And I think that's what it's all about. People tell me, people ask me, so, what did you think about the Climate Kick program? And of course, it was a great funding program, and the funding was part of the help. But especially in the first year, the biggest help I got from Climate Cake was a community of people that were just excited about Carbon Delta, although there was nothing. They just liked the idea. And I would meet them, and they'd be, I would look at smiling faces, and they'd be like, yes, Oliver, we think it's good. It's a good thing that you're doing. And that was so much more valuable to me than, anything else. Because otherwise I would have just sat in my kitchen and would have had no feedback on my business idea.
Can you also give us a quick rundown of the different solutions that you actually offer with Carbon Delta? Because you have different potential clients that you serve, right?
Well, it's mostly what, in the financial industry is called institutional investors. And it's just, any institution or person that has money is usually an institutional investor. So, we're looking at pension funds or insurances, banks, universities, in the US, you name it. These types of institutions that invest, those were our clients. And basically our product was a comprehensive a computer program that would calculate the climate change risk, different aspects of it in this system. And I think to make it simple, I think traditionally people would calculate a score, like 1 being bad and 5 being good, or something like that. And what we did was similar, but more interesting for investors. We would say minus 5% on the stock price or minus 50%. We would translate it into a dollar value. And I think that just made the big difference.
Right. In that regard, in your product's DNA, you also focused on the climate value at risk approach instead of, for example, pure carbon footprinting. Can you explain the difference and why it made sense to have your focus in your product?
So carbon footprinting is looking at what impact would a portfolio have on the climate. And that's a very important environmental exercise. But you have to realize that a portfolio manager, imagine you're a portfolio manager and you're sitting in front of your, terminal today, and you're wondering, what are you wondering? You're wondering, where are the markets going to go? What's going to happen with these assets? They're doing that for somebody. Somebody's investing and the portfolio manager is trying to manage this. So the focus is on creating return. And I think in the, sustainability space, people sort of are so anti-capitalism, maybe sometimes, that they even think that creating return is a bad thing. So this whole view that a portfolio manager has a strong desire to create return, I think doesn't even occur to many environmentalists. But I was trained at Fish Asset Management over 10 years that that's the objective. And I actually felt like it was a really good thing. It's a good thing to try to create return. And I was thinking, how can I help portfolio managers to create return? So I said, we need to turn this whole idea around. We need to look at what impact does climate change have onto the valuation of the portfolio. So it's not portfolio on climate, it's climate on portfolio. And this reversal of thinking, I think, was the key success factor for this product, Climate Value at Risk.
Got it. And talking about timing, when you actually launched Carbon Delta, there was already an American competitor in the market, MSCI. They were already active and also had clients. Why did you decide that it's still a good time to launch a company and probably, get into competition with them potentially?
I didn't think about timing that much. And probably if I would have had the idea 3 years earlier, 5 years earlier, I would have already done it. And ironically enough, one of the first things I did was I contacted MSCI and I told them about this idea. And I sent them a short paper outlining the main idea and whether they would be interested in collaborating. But at the time it was, when you send out a PDF with a few paragraphs of words, it doesn't look very shiny. It's just an idea. It's not very appealing. And I mean, that's the beauty of, it's not like MSCI didn't understand, where the market was going or what they needed. It's just natural that big companies it's more problematic in a big company to do something revolutionary than as a startup. Because obviously, a respected company like MSCI has high quality standards, processes to check stuff, IT requirements, things like that. As a startup, you don't have that, and you have the freedom to just move ahead. And that was our advantage. And that's why startups can outrun even big corporates with a big, money pocket. That's how it is, and that's the game, and that's the beauty of it.
Did you ever get a response from MSCI up on your PDF?
MSCI outright declined. Okay. They were fairly aggressive about it. They said, they actually also declined giving me data, because I had inquired either that they would, that I could become a customer of MSCI or a cooperation partner. And I have to admit that I was a little bit insulted at the time, because I felt like, why don't you want me as a customer? But they didn't want to create a competitor. I mean, that was, and I right. Totally understand that.
And how did you then take it from there? I mean, that could also be like a significant bet that you took and say, hey, I need this data or this partnership to actually execute it and realize the idea that I had for Carbon Delta. And just when that doesn't go the way that you planned, you could also just say, doesn't work, I do something else.
I was totally determined to make it work, no matter what. So I just, over the last weekend, I sorted all the business cards I had collected over the 4 years of Carbon Delta. It's way over 1,000 business cards. So I met over the course of 4 years more than 1,000 people, because I didn't collect business cards from all of them.
Right.
So you can imagine I met a new person. On average, I met one new person every day. I mean, I was just killer determined to make anything work. And David and Elke were the same way. We were like almost literally running our heads through the wall. I mean, David and I, when we came back from business trips, sometimes we were like close to a breakdown because we just totally like overdid it. Yeah. But it was great.
Before we continue with the show, we would like to introduce you to our new partner, NewCo. NewCo helps founders navigate the paperwork that starting a company involves. From the first consultation all the way to the commercial register, NewCo has helped more than 900 entrepreneurs start their company, and they do so at highly competitive prices. To find out more, visit newco.ch/Swisspreneur. Again, that's newco.ch/Swisspreneur. And now, on with the show.
I think it's beautiful if you can say that about that intense journey, but where did that determination come from? What was so motivating? What kept you going that you actually wanted to make it a success so hardly?
It's just the way I am.
That's a simple explanation.
I think it is like that. I mean, some people, when I do stuff, I observe myself. When I get into stuff, I get a little bit obsessed with it. For example, I'm a hobby guitar player. Really, I don't play guitar well at all. But over the last 12 months, I've probably watched 300 videos on music theory. I just find it so interesting and fascinating. And I want to understand exactly, what I don't know why.
Did you do any competitive sports when you were young, where that comes from, or is it just the pure desire for learning, growth, and progression, basically?
No, I did almost no sports when I was in. But maybe if I would have gotten into sports, maybe I would have become very competitive as well. I mean, I could totally see that how that is. No, I was. I spent way too much time in front of my first computer. I mean, literally, for weeks, I would, at the time when you had a home computer, you didn't have monitors. You would hook up a home computer to a TV. And the point is the TV has a very low frequency for the, image update. So it's very hurtful for eyes to look at a computer screen on a TV, like an old school TV. So, I frequently remember that I would go to bed at 2:30 in the morning because my eyes were hurting so much that I couldn't look at the screen anymore. And I mean, I was writing very simple programs, but I think it helped me understand very early on how programming works.
Absolutely. Now, let's also look a bit at the obstacles that you faced when building Carbon Delta. There are always challenges when building a startup. One of the obstacles that you can face as a social impact startup is obviously that you are linked to doing good in the world, but at the same time, people often also say you don't deliver enough or any return at all. You have a difficult business model. It's hard to make money as a social impact startup. How did you cope with that challenge? Because you seem to come from a very return-focused culture back from your asset management career.
Well, I would say what I observe also with other people, I think the greatest influence to start a sustainable business probably came from my mom, who, I think in the 80s started to think about these environmental issues very early on when, something like sustainability wasn't a topic. So I was influenced very early on. And for example, I had decided, I don't know how, maybe I was 16 or something, I'd already decided that I would never own a car because it felt wrong to me to burn all this oil. It just felt wrong to me. I didn't even, know about climate change at the time. I was just thinking, that's just wrong in principle to use up resources in that kind of way. So I think there are many, many people that feel like that as a consumer. So that's great. So when you start a company that is related to sustainability, you will not have any problems finding, dedicated employees and coworkers. On the other hand, I think the investor community is actually completely reversed. I think there's a general sentiment that still, and that's my honest view, nobody says that because it's not, politically correct to say that, but I think most people think that if there's too much sustainability in the business, it's not going to create return. And I think that sentiment is still there. And I think it's wrong. And I think it's wrong and wrong. I think it's ethically wrong, and it's also factually wrong.
But why do you think, where does that come from? Why is that still a thing that we need to talk about today from an investor's perspective?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it's, I have this kind of picture in my head of, I don't know, I would call it hardcore economics, that maybe we sort of think and breathe as a society, and sustainability just isn't in there.
Because it's crazy. You are the perfect example that a sustainability startup can actually deliver great returns.
Well, I think an investor would probably say, well, let's look at a range of climate change startups.
Right.
And then look at, like in a private equity fund or something like that. And then let's look at the overall return. I think private equity returns, for example, weren't that great over the, last 10 years, 15 years. Yeah. I still believe absolutely that let's say the potential between, what we need to do and the speed at which we need to do it, and the speed of the transformation is just, let's say, widening the gap between traditional companies and sustainable companies. So I think, there's what we're seeing now, sustainability companies being successful, it's going to actually accelerate over the next 10, 20 years.
So that's a good trend, I would say, that we are facing here over the next years.
Yes.
Another challenge that you actually faced was acquiring clients or doing sales, basically. How do you go about that? Because that's usually a huge challenge that you have to face as a startup.
First of all, I think that most startups, it's natural. Startups are built by product people. The product is the center, usually, of a startup. So it's all about the product. And it was the same at Carbon Delta. We were in love with our product. And that's usually not the best way to sell, because you're then internally focused on that, externally focused on what the client really needs. And it's also sometimes harmful for the sales process, I think, because if you talk too much about the product and inquire too little about what the client needs, you're not going to be a successful salesperson. So I always try to motivate good salespeople to join startups, because I think that's usually a missing piece of the spectrum. And I also think that most students that come from a university career and then dive right into a startup, they have this expectation that you need a perfect product and then you can sell it. They see buying an iPhone in the Apple store and they think they have to do the same thing. But especially in B2B sales, that's not at all the case. You can actually just have an idea and go to a big corporate and tell them, I have the people that can do this. Would you be interested? And if you do it in a great way, you have a deal. And I think that's almost the hardest thing to teach startups, because there's always a tendency to just go back into the office and to work on the product. And that's a huge problem, because if you work on the product too long, the money's gone and the company's dead.
Right. Yep. Unfortunately, that's the case. But luckily, there are also things that were easier than you expected. You mentioned before hiring people. It was one of these things. Why was that so easy for you to hire and find the good people?
Zurich is a great place to start a climate company. We have, at ETH, we have environmental engineering. We have other areas of study that are related to the environment. So, you have a lot of young people. They're totally convinced about climate change and they want to join a climate change company. And still to this day, it's surprising there aren't that many climate change jobs on the market. So we would put out a job ad and we would receive, well over 100 applications within a week.
Wow.
So you can imagine, I mean, this was a great job market for Carbon Delta.
And also the right timing to be in the market and to really, support the people that are looking to get active in that field and are looking for a job. I think that's the perfect combination. Then the other thing that was also pretty difficult, you mentioned to me, was finding investors. How did you go about that, and how did you actually find a workaround around that, and then were able to convince investors to join?
Well, I think we were totally determined and focused on getting clients, because we felt like with clients, everything else is going to trickle down.
Yeah.
And that was true. We had, great names as clients. And so I didn't focus on raising money very well. So that's why it was difficult to raise money. Also, I didn't know that well how to do it. Now, I had a fantastic pitch trainer. So I think my pitch was at least good. We ended up raising through Zigtig, and Zigtig was instrumental in this, the funding round. But I think it could have easily gone wrong. And I didn't have a great network of wealthy people, or I didn't have any good relationships with banks or whatever. And a lot of investors told me they're only interested, starting with companies that make at least $1 million in revenue. I mean, we were at the time still a factor of 10 away from that. So, yeah, I think surprising to me today, it was difficult. But Switzerland, Germany, these aren't countries where a startup investment is a big thing. So you have a very somewhat limited community of people that are interested in investing. We also spent some time in New York looking for investors in New York, and maybe it would have been easier to find investors there. But the big problem was that, of course, they want to be close to the startups. So they said, "Are you ready to move to New York?" And we weren't ready to relocate 3, 4, or 5 families to the US, and there was no way to get green cards for everybody. I mean, that was just a non-starter.
Yeah. So then Zigtig eventually financed you and was also essential to then leading up to the sale of your company. In that regard, I would also like to talk about supporters and opponents that you faced along the way. So supporters, Zigtig was one with the investors part. Who else supported you along the journey that made a significant contribution to the success of Carbon Delta?
Well, as I said, Climate Kick was instrumental in the success, giving us visibility, giving us credibility through the, we won the European Startup Award with Climate Kick. I mean, that was a great achievement. And I think it's great when you start a company and you interact with people, you find a lot of people that would give you a few hours of their time and help you. It's really great. It's amazing. So, for example, one startup coach working for the Mass Challenge program came by our office and came by and said that he had also started a company, and that he's a big fan of blue ocean strategy, and that he thought that Carbon Delta was a great example for blue ocean strategy. And I mean, I have to say, I'm also a big fan now of blue ocean strategies. And what it helped me psychologically with Carbon Delta was to transition from me thinking we're just crazy building a product where the market doesn't already exist, to thinking this actually makes sense. It can be a sensible strategy. Right. And these are the elements why we're doing it. And these are the blue ocean techniques to manage that strategy. So I think it was a fundamental psychological support that I got from that, tip. And we never heard from that guy again. He didn't have time to support us further. But that's just one example of people that just come along and help you. And then, we had 10 angel investors from SIGTIC. They were really helpful all the time. I mean, I could contact any of them and ask them for help, and they would do that. Thomas Dübendorfer, for example, from the SIGTIC president, I mean, he helped us all the time with, various issues. We had great lawyers that would help us. ZKB was also invested in that investing round. I mean, ZKB has a great team that is extremely supportive. You get a lot of help. It's really cool.
Fantastic. On the other hand, I can imagine there were also opponents. Who comes to mind when you think about opponents that you faced along the journey?
I don't have much of an image of opponents. Maybe I have an image of competitors. Mm-hmm. And that's natural. We did try a number of business corporations with some of those competitors. And I think even with the, best faith collaboration ideas, to be honest, we would most times fail because that competitive situation would somehow get into the way. So when it comes to exactly signing a contract or limits or revenue shares or whatever, I think product people oftentimes, think, that it's a great idea. I get this from you. I give this, and the combined product is so much better. And those are usually great ideas. But when it comes down to the whole business model, how's this going to work? Who's going to bring the client? How's the share? How is everything that is brought into the collaboration valued? It becomes very tricky, and oftentimes it falls apart a little bit.
Right. And to what way would you also say that, climate change deniers, or to a certain degree, even the general public, were opponents that you faced?
Well, I have more of a feeling of ignorance on that side. I mean, we would have a lot of... The interesting thing was that getting a meeting at any bank, for example, in Switzerland, was not a problem. I could practically call up any bank and get a meeting. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing was that we would oftentimes, we were these kind of product people that would talk for about an hour about our product, listen very little to the client. And in the end, we would realize, the people that we have in front of us don't believe much in climate change. And at times, it was really shocking to me. C-level people at banks in Germany or Switzerland would then frequently, say things like, well, you can have different views on climate change. I read an article by a professor in Geneva or something, and then, quote some, obscure thing about climate change, or, would jokingly say, can you, the only thing I'm really interested in is, could you tell me about my property that I have in northern Germany, whether it's, threatened by flood? I was like thinking, I understand the concern that you have about your private assets, but shouldn't you be more concerned about the assets that you manage? And, think about that risk, that's just like, a million times larger. So, I was sometimes quite shocked about the ignorance towards climate change. And I think that's changed a little bit with the Paris Agreement and mostly with the Fridays for Future movement. Yeah. I did sense a complete different reaction to Fridays for Future than any article or IPCC report or whatever. A young person sitting at the dinner table saying, I'm not going to school tomorrow. That just, I think, hits a lot of parents so differently on such a differently emotional level. And these kids are right. Climate change is probably the biggest generational injustice ever on planet Earth. So, they're absolutely right in voicing their concern.
Absolutely. Now let's get back to the journey. In 2019, just 4 years after you actually founded Carbon Delta, and we also talked about MSCI, you actually sold Carbon Delta to that MSCI, the American competitor. Can you walk us through how the deal actually happened?
We, in the end, the finance sustainability community is not that large. It's a couple thousand people in Europe. And there are a number of events that everybody goes to. And we would go there and, at some point, Carbon Delta was able to afford a stand. And actually, we were really proud. We had a backdrop printed at some point. And of course, MSCI was also at these events. So we started to get to know all of our competitors and the people that work there. And of course, there are, beers at the bar in the evening, and we would talk to these people. And about a year and a half before the acquisition, we started to get the sentiment from the salespeople at MSCI that they were very frustrated that MSCI was getting messages from some of their clients saying, no, climate change, we don't need to talk about climate change because we're already working with a company from Switzerland. And they weren't used to that. They were thinking, being sort of the market dominator in the ESG space, they were thinking that's strange. And I think essentially that triggered a process at MSCI. And the first thing we had planned was a joint product. So MSCI would send us data, we would do some computations, we would send it back to MSCI, and they would sell it as the MSCI Climate Value at Risk. Mm-hmm. And that was a great idea, and we were really excited. And then we were approached by a big brand name in the UK very aggressively, saying, we want to buy you. We investigated the climate change space. We think you're the number one. We want to buy you. And we were very flattered by this big brand name and started this discussion. And in the end, felt like we have to tell MSCI, because we were planning this collaborative product, that this is, sort of in the thinking. Mm-hmm. And that's where the whole process started. And, people understood more broadly. Some people, I think, that we might be willing to sell. And MSCI then got very engaged and became very interested. And it was also interesting because we then realized that MSCI was, on so many levels a better buyer and a better future for Carbon Delta than this other brand name. And that goes back to maybe a business practice that I think is very high level, but important. If you want to make decisions in life, I think you need to consider alternatives. If you're just considering one option, yes or no, the answer is mostly yes, because you don't want to miss out on an opportunity. It's natural. Right. But if you have a second option, you might think that first option isn't that great. And it was the same when selling Carbon Delta. And MSCI didn't only buy us for our product, but I think they also bought us for our programming expertise. They bought us for some of the business practices we had, and they just bought us because we were a running team. And so that I think there were, a couple of aspects that were appealing to MSCI.
For how much did you actually sell the company for?
The acquisition value is not disclosed. That's part of the agreement, but I think the best formulation is that our angel investors were very satisfied with the deal.
Okay, so they made a good return on the, I think in Crunchbase it said you raised about 1.7 million in total from your angel investors. So that gives people sort of an understanding about the potential multiples there. Now we also wonder, what is next for you, Oliver? Now you sold your company, what do you tackle next?
Well, climate change still is number one for me. And the work I can do at MSCI for me seems like my very best way to leverage my capabilities to for a systemic transformation of the finance industry in its own interest, you know. And so I see my future at MSCI.
So there are no plans for a new startup yet.
So I didn't do any sports as a as a kid, but I did get into triathlon about 20 years ago, and so I think there are these things in life where it's like a marathon, for example, or maybe women having children, where after the event you're like, I'm never ever going to do this again. And maybe after a few months or years or whatever, you start thinking about it again because you forget about the pain.
Right.
And after the acquisition, I would tell people never ever again. I'm just so happy this is in a safe haven, and maybe sometime again, I don't know, but since I'm not making any concrete plans because my job at MSCI is so, let's say, filled out with, my mental capacity is just used up with, my work at MSCI right now. So if you don't have this kind of creative thinking around starting new companies, that's then not something that comes to mind.
Fair point. We always wrap up the Swisspreneur episodes with two last parts. The first one is about personal resources and gadgets. What comes to mind about, books, blogs, podcasts, gadgets that you use yourself on a regular basis that you can recommend to our listeners?
A friend of mine gave me a set of cards. They're called strategy cards. And they're kind of strange. They never really, they just have graphs on there. They're sometimes just two words, sometimes just one word, sometimes an image. And they're immensely helpful. It's so interesting. So when I think about a business problem, I just flip through these cards, and these cards give me inspiration to think about something else. It's just a great way it's like design thinking, these are techniques to get your mind off of your normal track. Mm-hmm. I think that's a great tool. It's called strategy cards. You can actually make them yourselves.
Okay, you would also find that if you Google it?
Yeah. Cards? I think so.
Okay.
I can look it up for you, and then maybe you can put it in.
Sure, we will put that in the show notes. I love the recommendation because that's something we haven't heard on the show yet.
Yeah.
And the last part are some rapid fire questions for you. I either give you a short question or a selection where you make one choice. Are you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
The first one is lakes or mountains?
Lakes.
Why?
Triathlon.
Fair point, yep. Where do you actually go to think?
The best thinking I can do when I go jogging. Absolutely. So I think I'm this type of person. I can't really sit down and relax and think very well, to be honest. I'm in working mode. So working mode means processing emails, talking to people, reviewing documents. That's like my 90% of my work looks like that. And that doesn't give you the opportunity to relax and think. And jogging, that's the beauty of exercise. Your mind just has to shut off. It's a natural process. A lot of people, when they do swimming, they're surprised that they can't count the laps. A lot of people think it's a concentration deficiency, but it's actually just the exercise that shuts your brain off. That's what it is.
Nice. The next choice, Switzerland or Germany?
That's a very hard choice. I actually, to be honest, I've been here for over 20 years. I go with Switzerland. Yeah.
Cool. What makes you smile?
I mean, I like, Helge Schneider type of comedy. This just cracks me up. Yeah.
Awesome. And the last one for you today, plane or car?
Bike.
Perfect. I knew that this was coming. Fantastic. Oliver, thank you so much for your time and for sharing the impressive journey of Carbon Delta. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Silvan.
We wish you all the best for the future and lots of success with whatever you will be tackling in the future.
Okay, thanks for your podcast.
Now that you've finished listening to the episode, why not top it off with a quick rating on Apple Podcasts? It's one of the best things you can do to help us reach more entrepreneurs just like you.